such as the Prafulla Chandra Rai and Post-Coloniality, Karigor 2017. And Vasundhara, Rabindranath Tagore and the Environment, Vishwabharati 2018. He is Joint Coordinator of the UKIERI project on the Scotland-India Continuum, Tagore and his circle, and the Deputy Coordinator of the UGC SAP project on Rabindranath Tagore, the East-West Confluence at the Department of English. Apart from his academic engagements, he has also translated and performed in Tagore's dance dramas at national and international theatre. He is presently also joint editor of the Vishwabharati portal. Among his major awards, he has won the Outstanding Speakers Award by the Government of India, the Research Award by the UGC, the Oxford 18th Century Bursary, and a host of academic recognition. He has traveled extensively as project coordinator for the UKIERI Award to Edinburgh, Scotland, as invited speaker to the University of Oxford and Swinton, Chongji University, Shanghai, China, as has also delivered the Tagore Memorial Lecture at the Rabindranath Center under the Mahatma Gandhi Institute at Mauritius. Professor Amrit Sen is also presently officiating as the Director of Grantha Vibhag, the publication wing of Vishwabharati since July 2018. On that note, let me ask Professor Amrit Sen to take over as the keynote speaker for this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Basu. Can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yes, you are absolutely audible.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Basu. It's my great privilege to share this Google Meet with somebody whom I've always considered as one of my mentors, Professor Shubhir Dhar, and of course, a host of other participants, peers, and I'm sure students of this new university, which will, I'm sure, go a long way. Now, we have 8 very interesting papers waiting for us, and I was quite thrilled to read the abstracts. So I will limit myself and my comments to approximately 20 minutes. And I have prepared a small introduction, as it were, to the questions that some of these papers also raise and some which have crossed my mind when I have extensively tried to read Rabindranath's prose writings and the translations in English. Now, there are a few basic questions that I'm asking. Why translation? I'm saying, why did Rabindranath indulge in these translations, and why have subsequent translations been done? What were translated? This is a very important question, especially with reference to Rabindranath's prose writings. You know, not all Rabindranath's prose writings, in fact, of all his writings, the prose writings have been probably the maximum. But in terms of translation, in terms of percentages, it has been the minimum. So what is this gap in translation, and what exactly are the prose writings that have been translated? How have they been translated? That's the next question that I'll put forward. Has the progress of history and the changed cultural studies perspectives affected this process of translation? And how have these translations been received and circulated is the last question that I'm going to probably put forward before you. Now, it's interesting that I don't have any firm answers and should not have really. But I'm going to pose these questions and try and answer them in my way and open it for discussion if time later on permits. But I would begin by pointing out that in terms of Rabindranath and translation, we very often go by the letter that he wrote to Indira Devi Chodurani. where he was talking about translation as suddenly occasioned by a bout of laziness and illness. You see, I don't agree with that. Rabindranath, of course, poses it in this way, but we have to remember a few things. That this process of Rabindranath and translation needs to be contextualized also in terms of the overall ambience within which Rabindranath was flourishing. And that is the Bengal Renaissance and the Tagore household. Please remember that the Bengal Renaissance was characterized by its bilingual nature right from Raja Ram Mohan Roy onwards. There were translation, and writing in English was one of its key features of the East-West encounter. And the Tagore household, of course, used this extensively, especially because of its sequence of visitors, very often from abroad, including not only England, but of course, as you know, Japan and China. And at a very young age. So the process of translation and the familiarity of translation was available to Rabindranath at a very young age. That is, his translation of Irish and Scottish melodies into Bangla. You see, this translation of music and its lyrics is another dimension which very few scholars of Rabindranath have looked at. And the way in which Rabindranath was continuously playing with different lyrics on the same tune, thereby creating different translated texts, is something which is worthy of noting. So my point being that translation was intrinsic to Rabindranath's process of growing up. This is my first point. The second is that when we look at the first texts that Rabindranath is actually translating, and please remember this, that Rabindranath's prose translations have a huge corpus of auto-translations. He translated his texts himself into English. The first being very obviously Sadhana. Now, many of you might immediately conjecture that Sadhana is an original English text. Why do I call it a translation? Because Rabindranath was trying to translate his major philosophy into, and for a Christian audience in America. Therefore, this process of translation of a religious idea into what was an audience that was marked by Christian Unitarianism is something we have to keep in mind as also part of the Brahmo Samaj tradition, which was indulging in this process. Therefore, the inspirations of Rabindranath's prose translations, at least initially, were drawn from efforts which were already being made as part of the Brahmo Samaj. The third thing that I would like to point out is that the East-West encounter was creating what we can call a systematic opening up of prose forms. What were these prose forms? Of course, there was the novel, which Rabindranath was experimenting with, which Bankim Chandra, of course, had started in Bangla already. There was, of course, the travelogue and the new travelogue to the West that Rabindranath talked about and wrote extensively. We have a paper on the Russian travelogue of Rabindranath. There was the autobiography. We remember that Rabindranath had two major autobiographical writings to his credit, and he insisted that these be translated into English. And very importantly, which the most significant number of papers have here focused upon, the short story, where Rabindranath was himself a pioneer. Therefore, to understand the corpus of prose translations, it is important also to understand the sudden proliferation of new prose forms that were available to the Bengali intelligentsia at this point of time. We'll also have to remember, and I'm sure yesterday it has been talked about, that from the 1890s, late 1890s onwards, there was a group of his close associates who were already indulging in this process of translation. We will include, of course, here Robi Dotto, Chukumar Roy, Jagadish Bose, Sister Nivedita. Therefore, with these translations circulating and Rabindranath interacting with many of them, in fact, not being pleased with many of these translations, the need for translating his texts himself, of conveying his own ideas to a wider public, became imperative. Now, very interestingly, we need to, especially in the case of prose translations, also look at the publication of an important journal that provoked and provided space for Rabindranath to translate his works. And this was in 1907, Ramananda Chatterjee initiating the Modern Review. The Modern Review, of course, as you will remember, became the most important and significant English journal of the times, where between 1909 and 1912, 15 short stories, 3 essays of Rabindranath were published. The translators included Jadunath Sarkar, very importantly, Sister Nivedita, Ajit Chakraborty, Loken Palit, Devendranath Mitra. Incidentally, Rothenstein read the translation of Devendranath Mitra of the Postmaster, which provoked such an interest in Rabindranath, and Tagore himself. Now, this is also very interesting, the process of translation, how they were translated. Very often, many of these were translated in collaboration with the author. And I'm going to talk about 2 varieties of translation a little later on. But these were translations where Rabindranath was participating to a large extent in the process of, in the selection and process of translation. So we have 3 kinds, or rather 4 kinds of translations in prose, made by the poet. Secondly, in collaboration with others. Third, by others of the contemporary times. And fourthly, by more recent translators who were dissatisfied with the qualities of the earlier translations. So we actually have 4 varieties of translations emerging and circulating in terms of prose writings. Post-Gitanjali, of course, and I'm sure this too has been discussed yesterday, Rabindranath became a global celebrity. And as Shishir Kumar Das points out, Rabindranath's more public voice becomes very evident. This is also the time when Rabindranath is moving from translating his religious ideas. His religious ideas were, of course, being translated in 2 basic texts. One was Sadhana, the other was Personality, to a more political voice. And this is where some of his most important, what we can call political texts emerge as translations. And that is his lectures on nationalism, The Home and the World. Gora has been translated by William Pearson. And therefore, we have a new Rabindranath, as it were, emerging post-1916, who is much more politically committed, who is interacting with the ideas of nationalism and internationalism, and therefore engaging in a whole new dimension of thought. I would then move on to another Rabindranath, who goes on to translate his ideas about art, aesthetics, and the importance of the poet's religion. And in this corpus, I would include the translations of his Religion of Man, the Hibbert lectures that he delivered, and tried to translate many of the ideas of his theory of the interaction of the divine in the human and the human in the divine. Now, this is another theoretical point which Tagore's translations keep on talking about. There's, of course, a major translation that he makes of the message of the forest and some of his very important ecological ideas, on which we do have a paper later on. Therefore, it's very interesting that this is another dimension of Rabindranath's translated texts. Finally, I would like to talk about the last texts that Rabindranath would translate, including The Crisis in Civilization, which advocate or somewhere talk about his final faith in man, and yet reveal a deepening sense of disquiet and discord about the fate of humanity. So these are the four phases through which Rabindranath's own texts were being translated by himself and his contemporaries. Interestingly, as all of you know, the choice of these texts was very often made by Rabindranath. The other texts that were being translated, The Home and the World, of course, became the cult translated text that was available to his contemporaries. And in many ways, Rabindranath had encouraged this translation, as well as Churan Tagore's translation of My Reminiscences, to project his own perspective. You see, this is very interesting. I find this very interesting. Here is a poet who has won the Nobel Prize and is being translated throughout as a poet of mysticism. Why did Rabindranath, encourage these translations of The Home and the World, My Reminiscences, and other texts, in fact, asking Pearson to translate Goda, is probably because he was trying to move away from the kind of garb that the West had put on him as merely a mystical poet. There were also translations where he was in many ways translating his own writings in Vishwabharati, in My University and other writings, where he was consciously trying to project his own ideas about education, about his institution. There were other essays which were delivered very often based on certain notes. For example, Talks in China, which he was retracting later on and publishing them in a new way. There's an interesting letter, in fact, when he writes Europe Probashir Potro, which was published, if you remember, in Bengali for the first time in 1881. And he was, 1878, and later on also in the 1930s. And he was suggesting that, for an author, the process of revision and translation is a continuous one. Therefore, there are many texts of Rabindranath which he edited, amended, and retranslated himself. Tomorrow, of course, Rakta Korobi is going to be discussed, and I'm sure this issue will be coming back. Right, therefore, it's a process of translation and continuous correction that Rabindranath was indulging in. There's, of course, another group of writings which I have not talked about. Interestingly, some of these writings were translated under the supervision of Rabindranath by Rabindranath Tagore, is his letters. And his Reminiscences of Bengal and Rabindranath Tagore's translations of these letters incidentally, were leading on to the familiarity of Tagore's intimate moments, his interactions with nature, and trying to create a context in which the short stories were being made or were being created. If you remember William Radice talking about how jol, stall, these categories become imperative for his writings of the short stories. Which brings me, of course, to the politics of translation. Now, of all his writings, especially in prose, the most significantly translated category has been the short stories. In fact, if you will remember that post-1950s, largely Rabindranath's prose writings have not been translated anew. It's poetry and drama which has received much more attention. But when these writings were being translated, when the short stories were being translated, what were the short stories that were chosen? The short stories that were chosen were inevitably those which talked about, human interest that was transnational, the example of which would largely be Kabuliwala. There were short stories which largely were, talked about art and artifice, which were being translated. But the political short stories of Rabindranath, in fact, Megh Orodhro was a short story that was translated, but that was not included by the Macmillan editors for the collection of short stories of Tagore. So obviously, within the colonial system, we have a Tagore whose short stories on women, on human considerations are being translated and published, but whose political dimensions were largely ignored. In fact, Rabindranath had to repeatedly write about Sriniketan, his efforts at building Shantiniketan, to translate his ideas for a Western audience for the sake of his school and also for the sake of his larger university system and the effort that he was trying to make. Now, what we see here, therefore, is a glut of translations on poetry, especially Gitanjali. A significant number of translations ideas to a Western audience. In fact, Shishir Das notes this point that in his poetry and poetic translations, Rabindranath was controlling the language. Whenever he moved to translating his ideas in prose, he was governed by language itself. But if you take a look at the ways in which Rabindranath was translating his prose, and if you take a kind of a survey, you will find that Rabindranath's use of metaphors, for example, changes very considerably. For example, in Creative Unity or Sadhana, Rabindranath is talking about breaking down the walls. He's talking about the communion with nature in a far free-flowing English prose. Yet when he's moving to nationalism, his prose becomes critical and is marked by a very powerful system of irony. In The Religion of Man again, Rabindranath's prose becomes far simpler, far more lucid when he's talking about the ways in which, the bowls, for example, represent the idea of a religion that belongs to the folk. And in the last writings, again, Crisis in Civilization, you will find a Rabindranath who is extremely bitter, a Rabindranath who is who seems to be almost despondent. Therefore, even in his practice of prose writings, in his practice of translating his ideas into prose, Rabindranath changes as these moments, as per the moments in his career. It's also very interesting to see how the politics of translation happens. In fact, when Rabindranath writes Rashiyar Chithi, there is no hue and cry at all by the press. It is only when the English translation appears in the Modern Review in one particular issue that the British the British government actually suppresses Rashiyar Chithi completely. Therefore, censorship comes in with translation. Whenever Rabindranath's works become problematic to the government, to the British audience, as it were, it is there that censorship arrives and tries to suppress translation. Now, unquestionably, Rabindranath's translated works have led to his great popularity outside, but once again, the paucity of prose works of Rabindranath make him only a poet of Gitanjali in certain quarters. It is in respect to that more modern translations of Rabindranath have come out. But I would once again argue that these translations have largely focused only on the short stories and the novels of Rabindranath. We have failed to read into some of his major prose works which are in Bangla, including the Shantiniketan lectures, for example, which are the greatest repositories of his ideas. Only a fraction of them were translated in Sadhana, and that too in terms of the idea. That is a rich repository which we have failed to translate. We have also failed to translate a large body of writings on ecology. His significant writings of the travelogues remain largely untranslated. And this is a process that Vishwabharati has undertaken to circulate his ideas about internationalism. And a lot of his letters to various people which reflect or reveal a more intimate Rabindranath remain untranslated. For example, I myself am looking at volume 4 of Rabindranath's letters, which were written to his children, which remain splendid, examples of writings which were specifically directed towards younger people. And there's a large body of literature for young adults that Rabindranath wrote, a large body of satire that still remains untranslated into English. Therefore, I would say that in terms of prose translations, we have a surfeit of translations in terms of certain genres, but in other specific areas, other specific genres, as it were, within prose literature, Rabindranath is largely known by his own translations, and a body and a corpus of translations remain yet unplumbed. It is this gap, probably, that we need to trace to see a Rabindranath who is beyond the mystical poet, who was politically engaged, who was ecologically conscious, and who had to make extensive comments about the religion of man, art, and aesthetics, for example. So it is this body of prose writing that largely waits to be translated by scholars and readers of Rabindranath. It is with these words that I would like to conclude my short address, and if there are, I know that this is not the tradition for a keynote to be open to question, but if Shubidda and Moni Kinkini allows, maybe we could have one or two moments of discussion so that, I too get some feedback from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the extremely comprehensive and a very enlightening paper. And I use these words meaningfully, not just as politeness. The reason is, you see, as you rightly pointed out, there are several dimensions of Tagore which haven't been translated and which are literally crying out to be translated. I particularly found fascinating your idea about how Tagore's English prose changes with the subjects that he's dealing with. Obviously, this is a conception in the mind of a person, a creator if you want, who's very conscious of the reception of his work in a colonial setup. Obviously, he was very conscious about censorship. Obviously, he was also conscious that the British government was keeping a lid on his movement. And in fact, there was a file in Lal Bazar which was marked in Tagore's name, and there was some kind of surveillance going on. And he knew this. But thank you very much. I certainly have learned a great deal, and I think your suggestions open up vistas of new research, which once again should be and can be and may be taken up by future scholars. Thank you, Amrit. Very well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, on that note, with Professor Dor's permission, sir, should we take a question that is there in the chat box for Amrit?
Yes, of course. Do that.
Actually, Sanjana Plawat was inquiring after this speech whether Amrit could please tell the names of a few untranslated satires of Tagore.
Well, you have a whole body of satires that Rabindranath wrote, but you will find that a large number of smaller satires like Shea, for example, have not been translated. There are a few pieces where Rabindranath, in fact, talks about the arjos, the division between arjos and onarjos in society, which he was writing about. These are smaller pieces that came out in Bharati, for example. These were largely written in a lighter vein. There are satires which he wrote also in Shobuj Patro, which are smaller ones, which are very small articles, which talk about, the concept of the arjo, and he was making fun also. Rabindranath is making fun also of the ways in which Bengalis have often talked about keeping women in the Antapur. There are passages, for example, in Europe Probashir Patro, which has just recently been translated, where there's an extensive satire on the Ingo Bongo, the hybrid Bengali, and the way in which he sort of considers everything English to be perfect, while everything Bengali is to be rejected, right? So there is and I would also like to remind you that there was an extensive interaction between Rabindranath and Dijendranath, his elder brother. Dijendranath protested and said that you need to respect tradition. Rabindranath shot back letters saying no, until and unless we sort of bring women into the forefront, there is no possibility. There are also his novels, for example, where he's making fun of, the Swadeshi experiments which blindly tried to sort of make matchboxes, for example. And he was talking about a more concerted effort which would be economically viable so that this would be possible. This is a text which was in Bengali called Chirokumar Shapa. And this has just very recently, over the last 2 years, been translated.
Okay. Thank you, sir. I think we had a brilliant session. Thank you so much. And even Sanjana Plawat writes, thank you, sir. So the question is answered clearly. Now, on that note, we would like to inform our paper presenters that Professor Amrit Sen has kindly consented to be the chair for your session, which I think will be an enlightening one because he's obviously going to guide us through the beautiful journey of today's webinar. And I would like to thank Professor Shubidhar for being the mentor and advisor on this particular aspect, where he has also asked Amrita to kindly consent for this particular job. And thank you everyone for your being present from the morning. And we start our session of paper presenters. And we have a student volunteer. Now, there are certain things that we need to keep in mind because this is a webinar. You will have 15 minutes of time to present your paper. And after which, there will be a warning, a written warning in the chat box provided by the student volunteer for today, which is Shomopriya Shaha. After that, you will have 2 more minutes to wrap your paper up. So after the 17th minute, there will be a verbal warning for you from Shomopriya's end. So we would request you to kindly wrap up the paper in the stipulated time because we have 8 papers to go. And obviously, we don't have a lunch break. So it means that we will all be starving to death if we do not be a little more considerate towards each other. On that note, without wasting time, I would like to invite the first speaker, Dr. Animesh Rai, Assistant Professor, St. Xavier's College, Jharkhand.
And Monica, can you just tell the paper presenters that we will have questions at the end of the session?
Oh, yes, please. Once we're done with the entire session, we will have the question answer session. Thank you so much, everyone. And now we begin. Thank you, sir.
Right. Okay, Animesh, are you there? Animesh? Hello?
I can see Professor Dr. Roy here, but Dr. Roy, would you please leave the meeting and join again in case you cannot unmute yourself? Because that way you can...
Unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself.
Unmute yourself or else leave the meeting and join again. You can unmute yourself in that way, if it's a problem. Yes, he has left the meeting. I think he is going to rejoin.
Well, technology does provide us enormous opportunity, but as I found out today, if it fails us, it becomes a nightmare. Anyway, Dr. Roy is back.
No, you are still not audible.
Can you please unmute yourself?
Okay, as we have some technical glitch with Dr. Roy, could we have the second speaker go first, with your permission?
I think that's a better idea. I think that's a
okay.
better idea.
In that case, I think we will have Sanjana Plawat, the second speaker, PhD research scholar, Department of English, Chaudhry Charan Singh University. Sanjana?
Yes, am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for providing the opportunity to present my ideas. Good afternoon, everyone. In fact, it's good morning right now. My name is Sanjana Plawat. I am a PhD research scholar at Chaudhry Charan Singh University. The topic of my presentation is the conflict of patriotism and cosmopolitanism in Rabindranath Tagore's The Home and the World. The struggle to maintain a proper balance between the personal and the social life is a very essential part of life. And if taken on a broader pedestal, this dilemma takes the overtones of the nationalism and the cosmopolitanism. This struggle finds its mention in various works of Rabindranath Tagore, with novel The Home and the World, published originally in Bengali in 1916, taking the equation to a unique level, which holds relevance even after a century of the composition of the novel. Imbued with Tagore's autobiographical connotations and the recurring theme of the clash between the personal and the political, the novel is an allegory of the human condition in the backdrop of Swadeshi movement. Demla represents the confused and displaced human torn